Autistic burnout. How do we recognize when we're in burnout? How do we recognize our triggers? How do we manage the sensory overwhelm? And how do we work our way through it? I have a very special interview with Dr. Anna Neff of Neurodivergent Insights. Hi, I'm Brett, the AuDHD Boss. On this channel, we focus on a strengths-based approach to autism and ADHD in the workplace. I have over 10 years of leadership experience and training, and normally we talk about ADHD and autism in the workplace, but today we're taking a very special detour so I can interview Dr. Anna Neff. You may be familiar with her amazing website, her amazing social media, her brilliant infographics, her Venn diagrams that help explain so much about the neurodivergent experience, or you may be familiar with her amazing book, Self-Care for Autistic People, which is how I learned about her work. Dr. Anna Neff is a neurodivergent clinician. They also have ADHD and autism. They are late diagnosed, like me. They are a researcher, a writer, and a clinical psychologist. And I'm very excited to mention that Dr. Anna Neff has a brand new book called the Autistic Burnout Workbook. I've pre-ordered it, and I've put a link in my description where you can pre-order it as well. It is out in a few weeks, time of recording, and I cannot wait for everyone to see this book. You're going to hear her talk about it. She's going to show a little bit of it. She just received the advances when we started to do our conversation. In today's conversation, we're going to talk at length about recognizing burnout when you're autistic. This conversation covers a tremendous range of things related to autistic burnout, but we're also going to talk about depression. But I do want to give a gentle warning about the last 5 minutes of our conversation, where we are going to talk about ideation and unaliving oneself and the thoughts that can come up for people with autism and ADHD around that topic. Now, this is an area that's an important conversation for us to be having, but I do want to let people know that that conversation is happening at the last 5 minutes. With that in mind, I'm very excited to bring you this conversation with Dr. Anna Neff. I am so excited. I'm very grateful that she took the time to talk with me and to answer all of my questions. Without further ado, we're going to get right to it. There are two things I really kind of want to start with. And the first was, how do we recognize what we're experiencing is specifically burnout? Because I think that's really been very difficult for a lot of autistic brains, is sort of understanding, it's happening now that burnout's existing for me.
Mm-hmm. That is a tricky question, because it's rarely, is it this or is it that? It's often, is it this and what else is there? So when we think about autistic burnout, I've been trying to work through a metaphor of what to describe, and I don't have a perfect metaphor. Maybe we'll get to co-create one here today. But I think of it's not quite the same as a diagnosis in the sense of, if it's something like sleep apnea, it's like, go to the doctor. It's like, this is sleep apnea. We know exactly what's happening to your body. This is the treatment. Burnout is not like that. It's more, I think of it, perhaps it's a wide net of, this is language that we have that captures an experience of when these experiences cluster together, right? Pervasive exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, all of the exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. For autistic people, sensory sensitivities tend to increase. And then a loss of skills. And that can be maybe less access to spoken words. Maybe, like, I'll often say, like, I'm just not wording, the ability to wrap words around the ideas in my head. Executive functioning skills will take a hit. So burnout, the word burnout, when we're talking about that, we're really talking about, like, the nervous system is in burnout, and it is overcapacity, and it can show up in a lot of ways. And there seems to be some distinctly autistic things that show up for autistic people with autistic burnout. But there's often a lot of other things in the mix, or drivers. For example, a lot of us have what Dr. Hauser talks about as all the things. So there could be, maybe food intolerances in the mix that's contributing to fatigue. Maybe there's gut issues. Maybe there's some other chronic health or post-viral infections. And then also, and we haven't even touched on mental health. There could also be depression in the mix. I'll pause there for a breather, but it's often this is a name that helps us capture and put a word to an experience we're having. And there are often other things in the mix.
I want to go back to something that you said, that part of struggling to find words. I think for a lot of late diagnosed people, there's a lot of trying to understand being nonverbal, and not sort of understanding that can burnout increase or bring to light more nonverbal struggles in that moment?
I think it depends how we're using that language, like access to spoken words or access to, so verbalization. When I think of verbalization, I also think of internal process and like text, like we can be verbal through text. So losing access to spoken words, I would say that's definitely been part of my experience. That seems to be a common experience for many people. More difficulty wording. If we think about what wording is, when we're putting words around our ideas, like there's working memory involved, there's executive functioning, there's coordination of motor pieces. So there's a lot that goes into the ability to let me take this idea and then translate it into spoken word. There's a lot of high energy processes that goes into that. So it makes sense to me that that is one of the things, access to spoken language, fluent spoken language, that can get a lot harder for many of us. Yeah.
So many of us are struggling to be understood in a very specific way. That takes so much more extra energy, so much more extra effort, and that can kind of sort of hurt a little bit more. Absolutely.
If we're also masking on top of that, right? So if we're essentially translating, okay, this is what I want to say. How do I now say that in a less offensive way, in a more indirect way? That is a whole other cognitive process. And so people will often, quote unquote, look more autistic when they're in burnout because some of the like repetitive movements like stimming, these might become more noticeable. We're going to end up relying more on routines to support us, to soothe, and our ability to mask diminishes. And so it's actually really common for adults. This is the time they get diagnosed if they are. Well, if you see diagnosis as a fortunate thing, and then if you're fortunate enough to get diagnosed, it is common to get a diagnosis in burnout because it is more, the autistic traits are more apparent.
What is the difference between autistic burnout and neurotypical burnout? I mean, you sort of said it, but I'll just sort of see if there's anything else to add to that.
Yeah, and there are a range. Like I've heard some people I respect say it's not different. I do think what stands out to me is that when we use the word burnout, I think it means very different things to autistic people than Allistic people. So Dara Raymaker has that fantastic study where they interviewed autistic people of their experiences of burnout, and themes emerged. And those were what I previously named around the pervasive exhaustion, the sensory pieces, and the what can sometimes be called skill regression or just the loss of skills. And that's going to be often more noticeable for the autistic person, partly because our baseline experience is different. So for example, the transition to showers, in and out of showers, that can be a hard one for a lot of us. There's a temperature change. There's a, wetness on my skin. That's a high sensory experience. Maybe you're someone who can typically handle that, maybe with some accommodations, but then in burnout, maybe that transition leads to a sensory meltdown or sensory shutdown, or maybe food. Eating is a high sensory experience. The struggle to feed ourselves. These aren't, when I think about Allistic burnout, I don't hear them talking about the struggles of like feeding self, kind of those activities of daily living activities. And so I think the pervasiveness, the intensity, I think we tend to have more felt impact from it. And it tends to be more global in the sense of every aspect of our life is impacted by it. So what I notice socially is autistic people might tell friends and family or coworkers like, hey, I'm in burnout, I'm running on low capacity mode. But what low capacity mode means for an autistic person can be very, very different than what comes to mind for friends and family when they hear burnout. And that's where it gets tricky, is people then don't understand the kind of severity of what the person's experiencing or what they're asking for when they say, hey, I'm in low capacity right now.
Is there language we can use? Because that's definitely something I've heard a lot of people talk about, that when they try to communicate, they're in low capacity mode, they're having a hard time being understood. They're having a hard time conveying the severity of that to people who don't understand. Is there alternative language that we could try to use to sort of convey this in a way to for somebody to get it?
Yeah. Oh, I would love to collectively create that. And I actually did with some folks in my community. We worked on creating some templates together to communicate some of these needs. And this would be a great, community resource if we could what is the language that's helpful? I think sometimes getting specific, and this is hard because it requires vulnerability. It's a really vulnerable thing to tell someone, I'm struggling to feed myself. I'm struggling with these. When I say burnout, this is what I mean. If there are a few examples that feel comfortable enough to share, and it's going to depend on the relationship with the person to give someone a sense of what burnout means for them. I think that can lead to a lot of those aha moments. This isn't the same kind of tired I'm talking about. You go home, you lie on the couch, you don't speak for hours, you go to bed, you wake up, you do your workday again. So sometimes those experiences are the things, and sharing that can be the thing that really gets the other person to realize, oh, okay, what you're describing feels pretty different.
Yeah. How long can autistic burnout last? Some people have reported that it can go have said their burnout feels like it's going for years, but how long does it last? And at what point in that timeline does it make sense to seek, more increased medical support?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to zoom out a little bit to think about the burnout equation that Dora Raymaker talks about in their article of burnout happens when there's been accumulated stress over time. Basically, when we've been exceeding our capacity over time, and that stress accumulates essentially beyond our abilities. And so, or I like to think of it generally as when we're working beyond capacity or true capacity. And when we're doing that chronically, yes, it makes sense that burnout kind of gets baked in. And many of us, partly because of the way society is set up, partly because of the various obligations we have, many of us are in that position. The way I talk about this has shifted over the years. When we are in burnout for that long, our HPA stress axis, our stress system is going to be involved. And when that gets dysregulated, that can predispose us to a lot of health conditions. And then we know autistic people are already predisposed to health conditions. So I would think if someone's experiencing years of fatigue, please go talk to your medical team. Please go see what else is in the mix, because there likely are very organic biological vulnerabilities that are part of that driving force. And perhaps some of those can be addressed. If you've been experiencing fatigue for a significant amount of time, I think that is an important thing to bring up to medical teams.
For some people who have left careers or left jobs that have really contributed to that burnout, have started to find their way back, how should we be thinking about re-entry as we kind of come out of that burnout?
Yeah, that can be an anxious time for a lot of folks. I almost want to back up a little bit, if that's okay, because I think there's a lot of there's things, right? There's things like, okay, are accommodations set up? If I'm out at work, are there accommodations I've asked for? If I'm not out, are there self accommodations I've set up? Am I thinking about energy pacing and pacing systems? Do I know my signs of burnout so that I know, okay, I need to ease off the gas brake here. And signs of burnout, I think that's important because a lot of us have alexithymia and interoceptive awareness differences. So sometimes it's external markers, not the internal, I feel tired or fatigued. It's, oh, I'm starting to do this. I'm starting to have more sensory meltdowns. So there's all that stuff. But I think there's deeper work that we need to do first that is often harder. And so there's the pragmatic stuff that's helpful. Things like, how have we sat with and are we working through internalized ableism? So until we've done that, we're going to continue to push ourselves beyond our capacity, right? Have we grieved? I'm still very much in the process of grieving my limits, and I have a lot of work to do in that area. And I know my patterns. My pattern is for me, when I get COVID, I will kind of lose access to my mind and my body for 3 or 4 months. I'll be in a very bad state. And then often I'll get some energy back. And it's so easy for me to fall right back into overcapacity modes. And partly it's because I haven't fully grieved what my limits are, and I haven't accepted that. And I'm working through that. So there's grief work in there. There is addressing internalized ableism. There is a lot of deep psychological work we need to do to be able to re-enter work in a way that actually works for us.
For some of us, those feelings can be so uncomfortable. We try to rush through that. We want to move past that grieving, or we don't want to spend too much time there. We just want to get to a solution to try to get past an uncomfortable feeling to get to a fix.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Even really good things could be a way we're bypassing difficult emotions. Like, I'm going to set up these sensory supports. I've got all my sensory supports right now, right? Like, if I'm doing that, I'm going to build an autistic friendly life. But if we're doing that in a way of bypassing all of that hard emotional work and labor, we're still looking for that quick fix, and we're still going to run into old patterns that are really hard.
And ultimately, it's going to set you back from the progress that you're trying to make, it sounds like.
It's awesome you're doing those things, and there's more to do.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask a random question there. Can that be connected to a little bit of the all or nothing thinking that we sometimes get trapped into?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Of if I do these things, and that line of thinking, just, I think for humans, it's a seductive line of thinking, right? Like, I can do these things, I'll feel less miserable. That's a really nice story. And it'd be nice if we didn't have to sit in the muck of some of the harder emotions that come up around this.
The connection between masking and burnout. Can you talk a little bit about how masking contributes to our levels of burnout, or the kind of burnout that we'll be feeling?
My challenge here is to synthesize. I actually have a whole talk on this. It's very connected. So first of all, if we think about a person who masks, they're less likely to be identified as autistic, first of all. So less likely to have access to accommodations and supports, less likely to have access to the self-insight of, I am autistic, these are my needs, these are my limits, more likely by employers and other people in their life to be held to Allistic expectations. So that in and of itself, right, that's a great recipe for burnout, is we're going to be trying to do more with less supports. If we look at masking itself, this is a very hypervigilant, high energy demand activity we're doing. So when we're masking, we're depending a lot on our prefrontal cortex. So it's not that we can't pick up social cues, but when we do it differently. So Allistic people have what feels to me like this magical ability to pick up context, pick up social cues subcortically. And so it's going to be a more intuitive process. It's like they're running kind of a background app on their computer or their phone that has very little energy. And we're running the big software that takes a lot of the battery up. And so we're analyzing okay, Brett just chuckled. I'm taking that as a positive sign. This means that. But if you were to furrow and be, okay, am I talking too long? Maybe I should wrap this up. I'm analyzing all that while also analyzing what is my face doing? What are my words doing? What is my hand doing? So there's so much that goes into that. At the same time, part of masking is also suppressing autistic traits. So for me, if I'm in a high sensory environment, that's a lot of load for my body, a lot of sensory load. My natural instinct is to want to move my hands, to stim, to release it, or to avert eye contact, to release some of the pressure. But we aren't doing that when we're masking. So we're working really hard. We're taking in all the sensory stress, but there's no pressure valve. So when we go home from a high masking day, if you're both I want to crash, but I also feel like I need to release something, that's why, because you've exhausted so much energy, and also you haven't been giving yourself access to the things that would self-soothe you in those moments.
I love that. I love that for two reasons. One, I love the analogy between the software operating system, because that just makes so much sense. And I love the way you described that second part, because for me specifically, when I have to go to a work trip, or a work conference of some kind, I have to work 10 times harder with my masking. And so when I come back from that, I have to sleep for like 3, 4, 5 days to just recover from all that extra energy that I put into how hard I'm navigating exactly how you just described it, with all that extra sensory input that I'm navigating in that moment. So that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. I definitely relate to that. So this was before we knew I was autistic or ADHD. I when I'd go to conferences, I'd come home, and my kids were younger at the time, and I would just lie on the couch, and I had very limited access to speech. So even if my spouse would be like, "How are you?" I would be using kind of my nonverbals, hand gestures. And we just knew this was a thing, that when Megan Anna gets home, she's going to crash really hard. Don't ask her questions. Yeah. And we didn't understand why, but it was just, this, especially after a conference or a trip where you're masking a lot, it can take days to recover. And again, that's the thing that Allistic people, unless you walk them through, this is what it looks like behind closed doors, they're going to struggle to understand what we mean when we say, oh, I have to recover for a couple of days after I speak at a conference.
Oh my God. Yes. Yes. That could be its own. For many of us, when we're sort of experiencing burnout, when we're going through that, it's difficult to step away from the things that we have to continue to do to function every day. For some of it's just, as you mentioned, like just getting up and taking a shower or feeding ourselves. But in even more bigger scales, just some of us still have to go to work. It's hard to sort of take too much time off, especially when you're feeling that. So what are some things that we can be doing or thinking about or managing so that we can still get to the core function of what we have to do every day to just get through the day? Yeah.
So first of all, I hate this question. But it's also the question that I get the most often. It's a really important question. I think the reason I hate it is I feel like this is a system question, but our systems are failing us. We live in a society that is anti-nourishing, that does not support our vulnerable well. We've lost the collective mindset in many of our spaces. So I want this to be a systems question, but it's not. So it gets punted to the individual of how do we do this? So it's not enough, but some of the things that can be helpful, I do love a good pacing system, a good energy system, and that can be spoon theory. It could be energy accounting. There's some unique pacing systems that have emerged from the autistic ADHD community, like ticket theory. So there's a lot of different pacing systems. I've even seen ones recently, I haven't tried any, where they will actually be connected to your body and give you like biometric feedback. But basically a pacing system is anything that gives you insight about, here's how many energy units I have to work with. Here's what I need to do and how much energy that's going to cost. And it makes some of these diffuse things a little bit more concrete, and also helps us to communicate with others. Like, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm all out of spoons today. So having an energy system, I just think, and pacing is helpful. Part of that is figuring out what are the non-essentials and what are the essentials. And so what can I drop? This can, again, be hard and connected to more deep work, because we have to be good at boundaries when we're doing that. We have to develop the skill of self-advocacy. We also, and this is one that I have like a lot of half-baked thoughts around, but as many of us are justice sensitive and then have that more all or nothing thinking. So maybe it's also about reworking some of our own ideals. So for example, when I was a young mom, I put my child in cloth diapers because that was the ecological responsible thing to do. Now looking back, realizing I was barely sleeping because my child was barely sleeping, and looking at all I was managing, if I could have released that rule that I had for myself, that probably would have had a very nice and positive impact. Or maybe it's about a meal service delivery. Maybe we have some ethical feelings around that, but can we rework some of the things that we're maybe holding on to as it has to be this way?
Again, sort of getting back to what we were saying about sort of grieving and working through internalized ableism, that if we can start to work through some of those rules that we have for ourselves that can be sometimes a little rigid, but also just how can we self-accommodate more? How can we lean into more self-accommodations, which we sometimes think really hard, well, I need accommodations from the world, but if the world's not going to give me those accommodations, how can I work on internalized accommodations?
Yeah, I think a lot of the accommodations we build are typically self-accommodations. And I think sometimes some of the self-accommodations we have can have a value conflict in them
Yeah.
I value my energy, but I also value, maybe I value organic food, but maybe there's a value conflict around that. So also having compassion for those value conflicts when they come up. The other thing I will add that's been helpful for me is adding in micro rest or layering on top rest. So by micro rest, I mean moments of rest. I think as humans, especially if we're also ADHD, we have a tendency to fill open space. Maybe we fill it with scrolling. Maybe we fill it with let me get one quick email off. Can we fill those breaks with rest, with I'm going to close my eyes. I'm going to take some cleansing breaths. I'm going to be in this moment. Maybe it's, if you are working, can you bring an eye mask and can you lie down for 5 minutes and have a more sensory deprivation time? For me, I have the luxury of working from home. So I use the Sensate. There's lots of things out there, but it's a vagal nerve stimulator. And it's, while I do email, I put weight on my body. I use the Sensate. It's how can I make this moment, how can I layer in 10% more restoration into this moment? So some creative problem solving around building in rest in micro moments or layering it on top of activities.
I want to make sure we really talk about the new book.
Well, I just got it. Can I show it to you?
Yes, please. That would be amazing.
So this is the book. It comes out March 11th. It's very can't do this very well. It's very interactive and visual.
I love
which
that.
I'm so excited about. It essentially the backstory of it was when I was making self-care for autistic people, I sent them 100 PDFs from the digital workbooks I make. And I was like, maybe we should include some of these as handouts. And they're like, this is a huge, big project. Maybe we should make a second book. So what we've done is, over the years, I've made a lot of digital workbooks around neurodivergent wellness, and we've consolidated a lot of them into a more robust, here are some of the things to be working on when you're working on autistic burnout. So for example, we have a chapter in there about masking and the connection and safe unmasking, a chapter on getting to know your sensory profile and how to work with your sensory system, a chapter on nervous system, a chapter on sleep. These are a lot of the vulnerabilities we experience that are burnout drivers, a chapter on pacing. So I'm trying to make it really interactive so that people feel okay, maybe I can't address all of these, but can I spend some time thinking about energy or some time? Can I make my sleep 5% better, 10% better? Things that are gonna, again, getting out of that all or nothing mindset of how do I push the needle forward on resourcing myself, whether it's improving my sleep or working with my sensory system in more alignment. So yeah, that's a workbook. I'm excited about it. I'm nervous about it, as I always am when, I release something to the world.
Yeah. Well, and even just that breaking down into manageable steps instead of just sitting in the overwhelm of just, feels so big. It's how do I even start? Where do I take this on? But having us even just, okay, I'm going to focus on better sleep, that, even just breaking it down to that one thing can make a huge difference.
Well, and that's something that I've been thinking about a lot too, is agency. I think when we have fatigue, when we have exhaustion, when we have burnout, it's really, really easy to feel very helpless in that. And things that build a sense of agency become so important. And so the way we think about it, right? The way of how do I make this moment 5% better? Or how do I make X 5% better? How do I work on one thing? These are things that often support agency, which becomes so important when we are looking at something that is so pervasive and so frankly frustrating to deal with. And actually, I think this is one of the things that also drives us to burnout, is that all or nothing of well, I've got to do it perfectly or I've got to complete it.
Oh my God,
and then we get into overworking. So also addressing our all or nothing thinking, that actually is something that can also be supportive in our burnout recovery.
Yeah. Well, and that perfection leads to with masking as well. I mean, it just sort of shows up in so many different places, and that just the toll, when you zoom out.
So one thing I'm not loving, Brett, because I wanted the answers to be like, do this for your body, do that for your body. I've been more using the framework of chronic fatigue syndrome recently, given my post long COVID stuff going on. And one thing I'm learning there is it's really common for people with type A personality to be the folks that get CFS. And so actually working on my personality and some of these type A tendency, I'm realizing, okay, Megan, Anna, like you've got to look at this. I don't normally talk about myself in third person. That was weird, but I'm taking that part seriously. And again, that's part of there's depth work that we have to do as part of this too. It's not just about setting up systems. That is a part of it. But
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about autistic burnout and depression and just sort of where there's maybe an intersection.
Yes, I think that's such an important question. This was one of the first Venn diagrams I ever made was autistic burnout or depression, because once I learned about burnout, I was like, oh, well, I've had many episodes of depression, and I could go back and say all of those were following an autistic burnout and following a really intense time in my life. So again, it's not going to be an either or, but it can be an and. It could be autistic burnout and depression. And it's important to know it when it's both, because when it's both, they both need support, but the support can be slightly different. So first, let's talk about like how to know if it's just burnout or if you're also depressed. So some of the things that would signal that maybe this is also depression would be things like, think about your relationship to pleasure. So there's a word, anhedonia, basically it means loss of pleasure. So when you're depressed, one of the things that happens is it's kind of like the world goes from being a color movie to a grayscale movie. And it's so difficult to access pleasure. So things that used to bring you joy or delight no longer do. So when you have the energy to access your special interest, does that still give you pleasure? Does it not? For me, when I've been in burnout, sometimes I have a hard time energetically accessing it. But if I'm not also depressed, it will still give me joy and delight. When I've been depressed, no, nothing. Nothing brings me joy or delight. Similarly, kind of how we relate to self and I guess existence, in the sense that when we're depressed, everything is terrible. When we look at our past self, well, okay, let me backtrack a little bit. So it can be common for autistic people to have a lot of negative views about self because of ableism, because of negative past experiences. When I'm not depressed, I'm able to see those for what those are. I'm like, okay, that's a painful thought. Wow, okay. But I can unhook from it a little bit, or I can remember times in my life where I didn't feel that way. When I'm depressed and I think back to times I felt good about myself, I'm like, that was a lie. That I was delusional. This is what's real. And so there's this confidence that depressed mind has of your life has always been miserable. You will always be miserable. The future will always be miserable. And that sense of worthlessness will be so hard to unhook from. And so that when I think about my distinctions, that's definitely a huge one, is I can't access hope about myself or existence. And then also, this is a tricky one, but so thoughts about suicide, thoughts about not living, this can be a common in depression. It's not always there, but it can be common. But there's also some suggestion that it can also be part of burnout. Now, there hasn't been research on this. This is a theory, a hypothesis. My hypothesis is with depression, it will be more of the classic, what we call suicidal ideation around, I don't want to be here, or fantasizing about unliving oneself. With burnout, it might be more of what's clinically called non-suicidal morbid ideation. If I go to sleep and I don't wake up tomorrow, there'd be relief in that. There's this, I want things to stop. I'm so exhausted. I want the demands to stop. my theory is that that sort of thinking is more common in burnout, and that the more direct suicidal ideation, that's definitely an indication you should talk to someone, and probably an indication that depression is in the mix.
Yeah. Well, and that makes sense, because in that state of burnout, the exhaustion, the overwhelm, the fatigue, it's so intense. You're just looking for any version of rest. And you could make that connection of, well, that's the only way I'm going to get the rest is through that. But that I can see the connection there.
You know, it's interesting. I'm just having this thought now. The first time I learned that phrase, it was in my training, non-suicidal morbid ideation, was actually such a relief to me. Like, oh, there's a name for this. The name of, I just wish I wouldn't wake up. Yeah. And then I think, because we can feel a lot of shame and fear around having those thoughts. For me, when I have those thoughts now, I'm like, what is behind this? Yeah. And I get curious about it. Like, is this telling me something about my limits, my exhaustion, my like, what is it that I'm dreading, that I'm waking, like that I'm having that thought? Well,
and I feel like having access to that phrase, that wording, it kind of takes, like you were saying earlier, it takes some of the pressure off. It releases something, because those are two very different versions of that. You know, I saw a therapist, 2 therapists back, where I brought up some ideation, and she just kind of looked at me with a blank stare and moved on to a different topic. And I thought, that's odd. And she wanted to focus on anxiety instead of other things. And had she given me that phrasing, that would have completely, first of all, it would have relieved me. It would have brought me down a level, and I would have been able to go, oh, okay, it's this, it's not this. I don't need to panic. So like, we need more of that. We need more people to sort of latch on to that, so that they know it is what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. Even as I was starting to etch into that conversation, my anxiety started creeping up of like, okay, this is a heavy topic. Do we talk about it? And also, I think it is an important topic in the sense that this is a risk of autistic people. And also, living with these kinds of thoughts is a common part of the autistic experience. There's this fear out there that if I talk about it, if I talk about these thoughts, it's going to make it more likely to happen. But actually, like, you know, being able to talk about it with your therapist, I wish your therapist had circled back to that conversation. Like, that's really important. And it's, and we can have so much shame around these experiences as well. Yeah.
My current therapist was like, totally normal. Here's how we're going to work through that. Yeah, she made it very cool about the whole thing. So she fixed that. Yeah.
Well, and that can be hard, right? Because we can mention to a therapist, it can increase their anxiety. And then we're like, oh, this is a really scary thing. Yeah.
Well, and it's one of those things, am I allowed to say this? Because if I say this, what's going to
Are they going to put me in a, yep.
Yeah. We need to normalize this conversation more, because I think it would go a long way to helping people who don't know where to put their thinking on that. But need to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
My thanks to Dr. Megan Anna Neff for taking the time to talk with me today. I'm so excited that we got to have this conversation. I love talking with her. I love her podcast. I love her website, her social media, all of the infographics that they make. I absolutely constantly refer to Neurodivergent Insights all the time in most of my videos and most of my social media posts, because that's where I get a lot of my references from, and it's where I do a lot of my learning. It's also where I can kind of understand more about my autism and my ADHD and my OCD experience. If you'd like to know more about Dr. Neff's upcoming book, the Autistic Burnout Workbook, I've placed a link in the description to find out more. You can pre-order it now. It's out in a few weeks in March. And you can also find out more about self-care for autistic people, which is published about a year ago, and that's available now. And please, when you click and purchase and do all the things, make sure you give it a rating and a review on Amazon and bookshop.org, depending on where you shop. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video today, please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel, and be sure to check out some of the other videos while you're here. That kind of activity really helps my channel grow. Again, I'm Brett, the AuDHD Boss. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out some of the other things while you're here.